Hi, today we're with Dr. Sierra. Thank you so much again for giving time to Lexical. And just to start off, if you could just briefly introduce yourself, that'd be great.
Sure. Yeah, I'm Arlene Sierra. My dad was actually Dr. Sierra, but now I'm Professor Sierra. So we stick around long enough, then your title starts to change. Um, so I'm an American composer. I was born in Miami, and I've been going home to New York for decades now. My family all were born in New York, and um, and I live in London, and I've been living abroad first in Germany and then in Britain for pretty much my whole professional life. As soon as I finished my studies in the US, I moved to Europe. Um, but really very happily, my composition work takes me back home to the US really pretty often, and I get to go home to New York a lot and work with many wonderful American musicians as well as European ones. Um, yeah, okay,
Okay,
this
great. Yes,
is should I
great.
say any more? Yeah.
After finishing your studies here,
Mhm.
what made you want to move to Europe?
It was a combination of things. Well, I think, there's a long history of American composers going to Europe. I think I was
Mhm.
very aware of that. And also, I mean, I think in all the arts, a sort of sense that to develop as an artist living in the new world, that you need to go to the old world and kind of see where it all began and have that connection to, even medieval music and architecture. It's just something that's a lot older for composers studying in the Western classical tradition is sort of this kind of homing instinct to go to Europe. Um, I think for me it was also um, kind of wanting to be grounded in that history, like to have a closer connection,
Mhm.
um, and I think also once I started to go to concerts in Germany and then in Britain, there was a sense at the time, and this is sort of in the 90s and 2000s, um, that the scene there was kind of more open and more adventurous, and it really attracted me for that reason too. Because
Mhm.
when I was coming up as a student, it was very much, and again, my perspective was really New York, that um, everything was divided between uptown and downtown.
Mhm.
Uh, like you remember that. It's
Yeah.
funny how it has this kind of continuing echoes, even for the younger generation. Um, there was also a lot of sense of American identity, like, that being a sort of hyphenated American, I have a Latina background, that your music had to reflect that in some kind of on your sleeve sort of way. And I think for me, going to Europe was to get in touch with something more pure, sort of arts for art's sake,
Mhm.
kind of just hearing a lot of music that was really about music. Um,
Yeah.
but it was also just some lucky life chances. When I was doing my master's, I was so lucky that the incredible French composer Betsy Jolas, who's turning 100 this year,
Oh
it's
my gosh,
amazing.
wow.
She's incredible. She was teaching at the American Conservatory at Fontainebleau, and so I went there to study with her for a summer, and
Mhm.
also study with the French spectral composers, Dominique Chancin and Philippe Mannery.
Mhm.
Um, and the kind of music that they were into, what they were doing, is just such a revelation after all the kind of downtown kind of fights back in New York. And
Yeah.
it felt so liberating to learn about that music. And then when I went to Germany, um, I studied with Paul Heinz Dietrich, who was a really interesting avant-garde uh, East German composer.
Mhm.
And then I moved to Britain, where I was so lucky to be able to work with Judith Weir and Oliver Knussen and Colin Matthews. Also Magnus Lindberg, the Finnish composer, he does a lot of work in Britain. So
Mhm.
I was able to work with these really incredible figures who just gave me such a new perspective that I
Mhm.
wouldn't have had just working in the US, I think.
Yeah. Oh, it's just because I'm thinking about maybe camps or summer programs I should apply to. I always wanted to go abroad. And I mean it's difficult and pricey too. But I really do feel like the learning music in Europe definitely is different than here. And New York especially. I'm in such a New York bubble.
Right. Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's a bubble I love, and I mean,
Yeah.
my family has very deep roots in New York, and it always feels like home to go
Mhm.
back. But yeah, the sort of hot house of the music world. Uh, I think in New York is very scrappy, people have to fight to survive, and it's really tough, and I just couldn't believe it when I got to Europe, and uh, of course this is the 90s, so there weren't euros yet, so you could see
Oh my,
WC on the 20 franc note.
oh my
You could
gosh.
see Clara Schumann on the Deutschmark
Oh,
notes. I
wow.
mean, I still save those. I have them in my little archive. But it was just such a sense that, composers are really part of the national fabric. All we get on our currency until quite recently is just, presidents and generals. It just that feeling that you can be a composer, that's your reason to wake up in the morning, and that matters, and that counts for something,
Hmm.
was so wonderful to see. And it's so funny living in Britain that when I first arrived here too, that there's a sort of British attitude that they sort of embrace eccentricity. Like if you do something really weird, it's totally embraced and understood. Like nobody's asking you, how are you gonna make money with that?
Really? Okay.
So it's a sort of sense that, oh, you're a composer. Well, how interesting.
Hmm.
There isn't that instant skepticism. Um,
Interesting.
so I found that, as I was starting out, I found that really inspiring and important.
Yeah.
That said,
Uh-huh.
I think living here all these years, I have a new appreciation of American maverick composers from the past, like Charles Ives and Ruth Crawford Seeger and Harry Partch, and really interesting figures as John Cage, who were a current of American individualism, that they just did their thing, even though in a lot of cases everything was against them. I mean, Charles Ives sold insurance from his whole life. Even so, there are these wonderful examples from American music history which inspire me too, because I think when you live anywhere as an immigrant,
Hmm.
you're thinking a lot about where you've come from and what you're doing in this new place. And I think it did help me to find my own kind of American history that was important to me
Hmm.
as an American living here.
Interesting. Well, thank you so much about that. I'm making me think about where I should go maybe for music later on. But
Oh,
when
that's the other thing I wanted to say is that
yeah,
also music is totally international.
right.
The more that uh, move forward with your composing, with your playing, you see that there is this, web of connections all around the world. And for composers, it's definitely, who studied with whom or who was in the same class with whom, and that is so international.
Hmm.
Um, so it's really helpful to tap into that as soon as you can. And you can do it going to American festivals too. It was really important to me to go to Aspen, to go
Hmm.
to Tanglewood. I met composers from all over the world that I stayed in touch with.
Hmm.
I even met my husband, who's a British composer,
Oh my
um,
God.
going to Tanglewood. So, these
Oh.
sort of international connections are super, super important, and give you opportunities, because when you come up together and you're in the same class, you want to help each other out. And now all my old classmates are old professors like me. So it's really nice to be able to stay in touch and know people working in so many different places.
Yeah, I was at the National Symphony Orchestra over this past summer. I
Mhm.
met surprisingly a lot of people from Panama, which
Wow.
yeah, and they were doing stuff on the violin. I was like, wow, nobody ever in New York would approach this passage like that. It was so interesting. And the thing is, Panama is not even too far away. So
Right.
yeah, it would be great if I could. It's like so many different perspectives that I just feel like I'm not getting light on because I feel not stuck, but hopefully I can expand my horizons sometime soon.
Absolutely. Do it. And the other thing is, there is, touch wood still, funding for this stuff. You don't have to have, tons of money from the bank of mom and dad to do this stuff. For example, Panama, I'm sure getting a Fulbright to Panama is a lot more accessible than trying to get one to France or
Yeah,
Germany.
I'm
So
sure.
so if you have an interest in that direction, there's probably funding available. Um, yeah, I think, I did all those kinds of things on a wing and a prayer, just getting scholarships and
Mhm.
student loans and stuff like that. But it's so helpful in the long run to do it. And
Right.
as you're saying with your example, you see people doing things differently,
Mhm.
and talk to them about totally different approach and background. And that for any kind of musician is really essential.
For sure. And just diving into the first question, I wanted to ask you what your initial inspiration for your compositions are. I know it could vary per piece, but just generally.
Mhm. Um, I think I because my mother's a painter and visual artist, I think I've always associated composition with the more classic arts, like painting or sculpture. And I've also been really inspired by visual artists because they create series of things, sort
Mhm.
of lots of interconnected works. Um, they're not trying to reinvent the wheel every time they make a new piece.
Mhm.
Things connect from idea to idea to idea. Um, so I think that really helped me get started. My first compositions were in electronic music and music concrete and sampling um, and algorithmic composition, and maybe that was more directly connected to visual art, where you could just get an idea and kind of lay it down, like make it into something.
Mhm.
Um, so that really helped me get started with my compositions.
Mhm.
Um, but after a while, because I trained on piano from the age of 5 and I went to lots and lots of concerts, my family loved classical music and took me to
Mhm.
hear lots of different things in New York and in Miami. Um, I really wanted to write for performers.
Mhm.
I just love that world. I was probably the only teenager I knew who loved hearing chamber music or loved going to orchestral concerts.
Mhm.
Um, but at that point, I had no clue about composition. It took doing electronic music at Oberlin that kind of got me composing.
Mhm.
And then I sort of found my way into notated composition for performers, just out of that drive to connect this new creativity to something I'd always known, which was
Mhm.
classical performance. Um, but yeah, my work developed, I've always done sort of a series of interconnected pieces which have a kind of uh, conceptual link and sometimes a material link.
Mhm.
Um, so so yeah, anyone doing a doctorate on my work is going to have a pretty easy time because I have sort of set collections of pieces that kind of interlink.
Mhm.
But it's also sort of the feeling that it's sort of getting a new perspective on the same objects.
Mhm.
Um, and what would this idea that's in a piano piece suddenly do if it were for orchestra, for example, or the other way around?
Mhm.
Um, and also the idea of kind of a narrative going in lots of different directions. So I came up with this form for the piece and this material for the piano. What if it had a totally different ending or a totally different type of development in the orchestral piece? So it's sort of choose your own adventure, like making different decisions along the way,
Yeah.
so that the pieces are connected, but they are also very different. So yeah, I would say that generally connects all my pieces.
Interesting. Actually, something you said earlier was interesting to me about how you said in the US you felt like part of your Latina background, you felt like you had to include it in your music. Do you, do you have any? pieces or like themes linking in your pieces about your own cultural background, or do you mostly not include yourself in your music like that?
Right. It took me a while to figure this out. Basically, so I went from Oberlin to Yale, which is where I started to really just do composition and nothing else. And then I
Mm,
got my doctorate at Michigan, which at that point was uh, with really postmodern American composers like Michael Dougherty, Bill Bolcom, William Albright. And everything about them was kind of American music, sort
mm,
of American vernacular music put into the classical arena, things like that.
mm.
And I remember, I think it was Albright, it might have been Balcom, saying to me, "Well, you have a Spanish surname, you're Sierra, so why don't you put some mambo in your music?" It just sounded so kind of
Oh,
shallow and arbitrary to me,
yeah,
sort of self-stereotyping somehow, you
right.
know?
Yeah.
Um,
How do you react to that even?
oh, I was furious. But it was really, I don't know. Now I realize it was really helpful to kind of have to defend myself because a lot of being a composer is kind of having to defend yourself. Like you have to deal with critics and conductors and so answering tough questions. Um, and I at that point I think I said, well, because it's not doesn't interest me. I love that music, but I don't need to make a pale imitation for string quartet. I'd rather just, put on La Mega when I go to New York and listen to salsa, or go to here, which was a life-changing thing here, Astor Piazzolla perform. I love Latin American music, but I didn't want to just do some imitation of it
Mm,
uh, in a classical format. That seemed very uh, just sort of shallow and also too easy, sort of nicking other people's ideas. This is taking something and saying, oh, well, I'm going to make it for string quartet, so now it's mine. That really bugged me.
mm,
But I did, I did grow to understand. And I think it helped being here and kind of distant again from all that,
mm,
to realize that there are certain sympathies with how I compose and the sort of Latin American kind of historical styles. So, for example, I always love rhythm. I have sort of subverted and, sort of processes of dance rhythm in a lot of my music.
mm,
Um, I love kind of rougher timbres and kind of a sense of drive and accenting and syncopation.
mm,
Um, I've always been crazy about minor keys and minor ninths and sort of things that sound Spanish on the keyboard because when I was training at piano I played you know all the Granados and Albanese and sort of all those Spanish piano composers. So I found that just very organically a lot of that background got into my music, but happily in a really personal way that
mm.
wasn't just a big lift.
Yeah.
It took time to figure out what I was doing like, instinctively, and then to kind of use the things that I was aware of in a way that felt like they had integrity. That they
Mm,
weren't just imitating something for the
yeah.
sake of imitating something. And I think that is important. If you really love a form or a genre, you want to respect it. You don't want to just steal it.
Right. Yeah.
So, um, but that was a major conflict I had with some of those old guys.
Yeah. I
With the,
can
with the,
imagine.
with the exception of Michael Dougherty, who was always very open and encouraging,
Hmm.
and his sort of main inspiration kind of 50s Americana, but it's sincere because he grew up in that world,
Mm,
and I get that. And it's not always my favorite thing, but I know it comes from a place that's real.
mm,
And so yeah, it's not that I don't respect composers who draw from other genres
mm.
or media. It's just I just need to feel that it's real and it's not just a big put on it, like it's just
Yeah.
taking something. And yeah, it took time for me to figure out how to solve that problem for myself.
Yeah. Um, Yeah, for sure. It seems difficult, especially when I mean I guess here when it seems like everybody's pressuring you to.
In a way, right? And
Yeah.
and and I think, identity questions are tough, and I had a kind of extra helping of those by living abroad. It's like, okay, so you're
Mhm.
American, but you have this. I mean, the Brits can't even tell the difference between an Italian surname and a Spanish one. So it was sort of, is that Italian? No, so sort of explaining one's own background, and even explaining that I come from two cities, from Miami and New York. It's sort of it was kind of hard, or that I have a Latina background, but Spanish is my second language, not my first.
Mhm.
That is a typical American thing, but to explain
Right.
that, when you're in other countries. So all of that experience kind of helped me to, not feel under siege so much with the questions at home.
Mhm.
And I think it does take time to kind of solve those riddles for yourself in terms of identity.
Mhm.
Um, and then also realize that it doesn't matter that much.
Yeah.
It's just,
Yeah.
um, it's important to have empathy with all people. And I think America's immigrant story is so important and poignant and serious right now.
Mhm.
Um, and I'm proud to be connected with that, to have so many, I mean, of course, we're all immigrants to the US unless you're First Nation people anyway. So, to understand that and to see that we have much more in common is really essential.
Yeah. And it's something that definitely shines through in music. It's something that connects everybody.
Yeah.
Um, I guess something that I've been interested in recently because I took a mini class on it on the side is about like female composers throughout history. Like it never really occurred to me that like all the music that I've been playing throughout my life has been by male composers until recently. I was like, that's
Yeah.
actually crazy. And I mean, I just want to kind of gain your perspective on it, especially as a female composer. Um, I don't know, have you faced any, you think, challenges or you think there's any like, why do you think it is that women composers have been so left behind?
Mhm. Well, I think there's a long history of erasure.
Hmm.
I think, and not just of women, also, Black composers and, various, minorities in the US for sure. But, you know, all you have to do is just scratch the surface of women's history in literally any field, in the sciences, in literature, in visual art, in music, and you see that there were all these women working and making and doing things, and then very actively forgotten by all the men who were writing the canon, the histories,
Right.
it's just a continual generations process of negating the work of women or stealing it, even worse. That's
Yeah.
certainly happened
Oh
in
my
the
God.
sciences. It's and I think that erasure of women is, it's a well, it's a crime. You're
Yeah.
stealing, heritage of half the population
Hmm.
and making generation after generation. I'm a bit older than you, and I grew up exactly the same way, learning my Bach and my Mozart and having
Yep.
literally no clue that there were really good women composers working in their time and in ours.
Yeah.
Um, so it's it is really hard to fight against that erasure. And then also, of course, in so many kind of parochial music communities, like in my piano studio, with my teacher when I was a kid, the few boys who were taking piano with my teacher would say, "Well, women never compose anything." They would say things
Really?
like that,
Oh my
and
God.
I didn't really have any evidence to fight that, and
Yeah.
it wasn't really until I got to, college that I started to see that maybe that wasn't true.
Hmm.
But even then, all my professors were men. It wasn't until I was at master's level that I actually worked with another woman composer. And it blew my mind, to
Yeah.
to work with, I worked with Betsy Jolas, I worked with Tanya Leon. Started to see other women composers around. Like I saw Augusta Reed Thomas when I was at Aspen, and it just started to open my eyes. Like, these women have been working and doing amazing things and having careers and surviving, and they
Yeah.
haven't been forgotten yet because they're out there doing it. So
Hmm.
that was so, so important to see that. Um, but to
Hmm.
get to that point, I think you have to be pretty tough as a
Yeah.
as a woman composer. I mean, every class, I have a young son now, and every picture he's seen of my career is he says, "Mommy, it's always you and 10 guys, you and 20 guys." It's like every picture of me is with all these men. And
Yeah.
I, I had a very feminist upbringing and
Hmm.
pretty strong personality, so I was able to cope with that. And but it was a lot of pressure. Like, I would be in these seminars and think, if I don't ask a question or make a comment, there won't have been a woman's voice for the entire 3 hours of this seminar. Like, it really would kind of weigh on me. Um, but it also challenged me to get in there,
Yeah.
and to be brave and not be intimidated. And I tell my women students now, try to grab some of that entitlement that the guys have. Just
Yeah.
put it on like an outfit, and just
Right.
you know, because that's another thing that helped me even start composing was that when I was at Oberlin, I was taking electronic music classes, but the the guys, and they were all guys who were doing serious composition, they were like the rocket scientists of our conservatory. Like, everyone was in awe of them. They'd walk around with these huge portfolios and orchestral score paper and black trench coats. They were
Oh
so
my
cool and
gosh.
such attitude, right? And
Yeah.
I remember noticing them and thinking, oh, and they would follow their teacher around like little puppies, which again was
Oh my
totally
God.
not me. Like,
Yeah.
I was always very individualistic with, not wanting to be a carbon copy of some teacher, but that's what they all did. So, but I thought, God, they must be doing amazing things. So I went to a student composers concert, my very first one. I think I was 17 or 18 years old,
Hmm.
and it was terrible. I was so unimpressed with the music. And it's not because it was too avant-garde or too something, because I'd heard a lot of interesting stuff by that point. It was just really not great. And I just sat there seething and thinking, I've started my electronic music pieces, and I could do better than this.
Yeah.
You know, and it just kind of pissed me off and motivated me. I thought,
Right.
I refuse to be intimidated by, guys walking around with score paper like they're,
It's the attitude that they
geniuses,
carry.
right? You
Yeah.
know, um, so it just made me really determined. So even when, people would say, "Oh, wow, you're going to do notated composition," or even my boyfriend at the time said, "Well, you're going to have to learn, all the ranges of all the instruments. Can you really do that?" Yeah.
Yeah.
Listen, these idiots could do it. I could definitely do it. So I think, being annoyed was actually sort of helpful and absolutely a motivator so that,
Mhm.
it helped me to not be so easily intimidated. I think, I, sure, everybody has to deal with imposter syndrome in a field this competitive. Sure, it's tough, but I think having a realistic look at what my classmates were like, I just thought, I can do this well or better than that, and that's been really helpful.
know what you I totally know what you mean. Also because I've been going to an all-girls school since I was 6 years old. It's been
Oh
a
wow,
while. And
yeah,
so when I like walk into music school, there are all these guys, they act like they're like proteges. Not that they're
yeah.
bad at music at all, but it's really a difference in attitude that totally shifts people's perspectives. And it's like not even based on skill level or how dedicated they are to violin or whatever instrument they play. It's
Mhm.
really interesting to see because I haven't, studied with a guy in my class for a while.
Well, I mean, and they say educationally, certainly for kind of secondary school, that maybe that's really helpful that the girls in their own setting can be more confident and they're not
Yeah, for
constantly
sure.
getting taken down by the guys. But I learned another perspective about this with parenthood
Hmm.
because I I had a boy, and
Right.
who's absolutely great and a wonderful musician, and he's just turned into a teenager, which is incredible to me. But I just realized, reading him stories and taking him around as a little kid,
Hmm.
that and I mean, I knew this in other ways, but I never saw it from literally age 0 before.
Hmm.
That our society hands every possibility to boys, and I'll never forget. I was in this kind of toy store, and my son was a toddler at the time. Crawled into this little electric kitty car thing. Right, he
Hmm.
just sat there. I was moving the wheel, and he was doing exactly what I would have done. I loved those things when I was a kid. And people walking by would say, "Oh, wow, he's going to be a race car driver." Isn't
What?
that great?
Uh,
Look at your son. He's going to do this great thing. And I realized, nobody would have said that when I was in the little car, when I
yeah.
was a little kid, you know? And
Yeah.
and thinking of children's stories and the kind of the young adult novels we read and stuff, and films even. I just remember as a girl just always automatically transferring myself into the hero, even if it was a man, like sort of doing that transfer of
Hmm.
sort of perspective, which I think girls have to do so often when we watch films, where or read books, unless you find the books that are really dedicated to just girls and women, and then they're sort of separate somehow. It's like
Yeah.
what's ever seen as the mainstream always has the male protagonist and always
Yeah.
has the active man and the corner the sort of ornamental woman there. And I would always sort of imagine myself as kind of the active man, just to
Yeah,
sort of make it
absolutely.
interesting for myself. And I realized with my son that he never has to do that.
Mm.
He's the
That's so
guy,
true.
just like the guy in the book or the guy in the movie. There's never that
Yeah.
transfer of trying to get around this obstacle of being a girl in this society. So
Yeah.
I think, this same way, you look up stock images of composer or scientists, and you see men, 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 men. You look up the rosters of all the professors, they're mostly men still.
Mhm.
It's changing, but too slowly, and it's a battle. But I never realized until, raising a boy that actually, yeah, it really starts from age 0 and it's kind of given
That's
among just
so
what people think
interesting.
and do, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. I I feel like I don't realize it as much as I should. I mean, really, I like just because I was there over this past weekend in my music theory class, I'm like I sit like in the middle and I have my hand raised constantly because I'm trying to understand what is going on in my class. And just something random, but my teacher has the thickest, I think thickest British accent ever, and it's just like so difficult for me to understand. So I have my
Mm.
hand up constantly asking questions, and like the girls sitting next to me, like they have no idea what's going on, but I just don't feel like they feel like empowered to ask questions because they feel
Mm.
judged or they just don't feel like they can. And so I'm very grateful for my like educational background and it's definitely given me perspective, but I have to think about it more. I didn't even think about um, movies and books that I've done the same thing that you were just saying about like making myself enter this male character, which I have no actual similarities with.
Right. Right. But yeah, I think speaking up is half the battle,
Yeah,
and you do everybody a favor when you do that because
yeah.
maybe those girls who don't say anything will be a little braver next time because you're putting yourself out there.
I
And
hope
it's also,
so,
I
yeah.
hope so. And and it's important for the guys to see it too, I mean, and I think that, just a sense of fairness is
Mm,
essential, that to try to have that in your day to day and try to help others to have that. I felt like I was really winning a battle with raising my son because he
mhm.
was saying, his favorite show. wow, Mom, there are only two girl characters and five boys.
Oh.
That isn't fair, is it? And I said, you're right. So he has this kind of, instinctive sense about fairness, and
Mhm.
because I called his attention to those things, especially when he would ask me, um, that we need to see everybody being active and everybody asking questions, and it's exhausting sometimes, but it is really important to be the example.
Yeah. Yeah, well,
Yeah.
I'm sorry, just because we're running out of time, I need to jump to just asking you whether you are comfortable with this recording being posted on the Clexical website, and I'll let you know when it's posted, but and also if it could be like republished in maybe a book anthology of all the interview transcripts that me and my friends have been putting together.
Hmm.
That'd be
Yeah, I think that's great. I think it's amazing what you guys are doing. And talk about speaking up and making things happen, right? I think it's
yeah.
it's it's really great to see what you guys have been up to and the huge range of interviews you've already done. So it's really nice to be part of it now.
I
Definitely.
really, really appreciate your time and your insights and just talking about the uh, what am I saying? Out of US kind of idea of music that I really want to get into. So yes, I'll let you know when the interview is posted. And actually, just because I am curious about playing more solo violin works,
Hmm.
um, if you have anything that you like and want to have out there, or maybe, I don't know, I've been just asking people if there's anything that I can just take a look at. I don't know whether it means I'll perform it or anything, but it's always interesting to see something new.
Yeah, I've not written a piece for violin alone
Hmm.
yet. I have a piece for violin and piano.
Hmm.
Um, and a string quartet and like various other string things. But I'm happy to have things sent, of course. Check them
That'd be
out.
so
See what you do.
amazing. Yes.
Great.
Thank you so much again. We really appreciate it.
You're so welcome. Great. Thank you.
Thank you. Have a great rest of your day.
You too. Bye.